George, it's great to see you, my friend. I know we haven't done one of these shows yet this year, and I know we made the announcement in like January that we were going to launch them, but time flies. But you've been a busy man yourself on multiple podcasts, which has been great anyway, because obviously sharing your story is one of the most exciting things out there. So I can't wait to see some of your new podcasts, which you've gone on and done on other shows, mate. But it's great that we can sit down and talk about football, especially the type of season which you've had so far as a Spurs fan, because it's certainly been an exciting, if not an up and down year for you. And you've gone from like European playoffs last year in terms of winning a cup to relegation battle this year, mate. How are you feeling?
Hello, Luca. It's good to see you. And the definition of that, my friend, is Spursy. Yeah, no, just absolutely bonkers. I mean, last year you could argue that we had the distraction of Europa winning, getting the Europa League title, or a belt being finished in 17th. But yeah, no, it's not looked good this season. In fact, I think we're in a worse position this season than we was last season.
And what do you think the factors are down to that? Obviously, you've appointed Frank where you had a managerial change, and Frank was sacked, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But what other combinations or combination of factors do you think contributed towards Spurs' negative season that they've had this year?
I think there's been quite a few things that hasn't helped with the situation in the sense of change of leadership at board level. I mean, I think we was on a pod like last year, weren't we? Was talking about the structure of Daniel Levy, etc., in there in an episode, and I suppose you realise maybe I can't remember what I said, so I don't want to say, oh yeah, I promoted Levy or I said that I was Levy out. Can you remember?
Yes, I do recall, mate.
But I think in some ways you could argue don't fix what's not broken, but was it a get out for Levy at a stage where after the Europa League was enough for him, or was it a case of that he knew what was coming within the club? That's a lot of questions that's left unanswered. We've got like Vinay that's come in and Johan Lange that they say has had more of a predominant role. Johan Lange, after a lot of research, argues that he had a failed job at Aston Villa, and since he's left, look how Unai Emery and his team at Villa have achieved now. So there's no leadership at board level. I don't think there's any leadership on pitch level either. I felt Thomas Frank, given his circumstances, he did as much as he could, but new goal for Spurs, bigger egos to work with, you could argue, which didn't help with the likes of Cuti Romero, that is the club captain. I'm going to voice it. I think there's Spurs fans that love him, Spurs fans that sort of loathe him, really, on that loathing side. Because if you're a leader of a football club, especially a club that I say demands to do well, in inverted commas, and compete to get into Europe, you need to be able to keep your head. He's never done that. And I think that was the final straw for Thomas Frank in the end. Now, what you call it's coming, Tudor's coming. Wasn't sure about the appointment. We was talking about it, wasn't we, off air, Luca? And I wasn't convinced, but after hearing some of his press conferences, there's no nonsense. He says it how it is, and that's what we've needed, I suppose, in this moment in time. I'm not saying that Thomas Frank wouldn't do that. I think he would, but I think he was mindful of, because Johan Lange is known for a little while now. Would he throw him under? That's another ball game. It's quite a toxic situation at Tottenham all round. Even that video yesterday, last week that I saw online with Mickey van der Ven and him refusing to take the instructions that Tudor was. I mean, Tudor played it down in his press conference on Friday, but of course he would, because he wouldn't throw his player under the bus like that. So I think Van der Ven's off him for summer, personally. I can't see him staying at Spurs, even if he was to stay up. So many players there. Yeah, just there's no spine in that team. No spine in that club at all. And I actually feared that we could be in that battle and we could go down.
You really think that Spurs could be in a position where they're going to go down to the Championship, mate?
Unfortunately, yes. I just think there's no spine in that team. As we say, no leadership, but also just even at Spurs, from speaking to a few of the lads at football that have gone to a few of the games, they said that the atmosphere of the ground is just so piercing that you can't hear anything. It's so quiet. Sorry, it's like, so subdued, and everyone's fearing for worst. And I think this is it. Is you look at Burnley, like yesterday, they was very unlucky against Brentford. That's another discussion for another day about VAR again, really. But I mean, you could argue Brentford, credit where it's due. When you pick back to 3-3 after being 3-0 down, there's only going to be one team to go on and win it, but Brentford managed it really well. But I think Burnley will probably cut the job. But I do think Forest have enough to keep them up because they've got enough talent in that squad, I think, as well as for leadership. Even though they've had to change of manager like 100 times this season. But West Ham, I think they've got enough to keep them up as well with Nuno.
So there is a segment that I've actually got planned in about West Ham, mate. But just to build upon what you're saying about Spurs before we move over there, do you think that, even though that you just said that you potentially think that you're in a relegation battle, do you think you would have been better off keeping Thomas Frank in terms of trying to stabilise the club and just having that year where he could have just kept them up and then going, actually didn't perform well and then sack him? Or do you think that the club were actually justified in terms of sacking him because, bringing in Igor Tudor, which was a big surprise to many Spurs fans, right? Just by bringing him in, you got new ideas, you got fresh face. Obviously, Frank was losing some of the fans. You had Mickey van der Ven, who was, falling out with him. Christian Romero didn't have the greatest relationship. So if you were in that situation, would you have done the same? Or being a Spurs fan and being in a different context, do you think keeping Thomas Frank would have been the better decision?
I think this is it. It's a tough one to answer on that. I mean, it couldn't continue for the way it was going, you could argue, because it was just going into peril, considering the start we had. And I think this is it. I still think you could argue that Thomas Frank would have found a way around it. It would have been, yes, a big risk, but in football anyway, every 90 minutes you play is risks. There's risks involved and attached to it as such. But I felt sorry for him in that respect because really, he's not a bad manager. He's a really good manager. He's shown that at Brentford with what resources he's had. I mean, Keith Andrews has continued that ploy, you could argue, and built onto a next level. But I think Thomas Frank's managed at the top flight level now for quite a number of years, so he knows what it takes to get out of that situation. And it's just that, where does the buck lie? If you're underperforming in management and everything like that, it's not for players that are going to be thrown, is it? It's going to be for management team. And even with, I've digested it, dissected it. I even looked at his coaching staff that he had with Justin Cochrane there and Johnny Heitinga that he brought in towards the end. All right, Heitinga was only there probably shortest stint as an assistant role, really, in modern times. But Justin Cochrane's a well-respected coach. And I felt that, I was talking to this about my granddad, ironically, and I said, look, you look at his coaching staff and himself that's got the experience, and that should have been enough. Whereas you could have argued when Ange was in charge, yes, Ange was an experienced manager, but his coaching staff involved a lot of young coaches learning their trade, like Miles Jedinak, Ryan Mason, Matt Wells, that's come through the academy. All sort of, I'm not saying they're superior by any stretch of their imagination, but you could argue, maybe Europa League winning titles side, that's kudos to them because that'd be on their CV in for the long run. But yeah, with Thomas Frank and his coaching staff, they couldn't seem to get a tune. I think Justin Cochrane's part of the England setup, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. Yep.
So it's like, I don't know. I just think it's that for players, maybe again, it's been I can't think of a phrase. you might think of a phrase I'm thinking of, but like all for him was on them to win for Europa League last season, and now they've won that Europa League. It's sort of like boosted their and driven their ego somewhat, that they think they're indefensible, and they think because of their status as such, they're too good enough to go down. But actually, the reality is that they're right in that mess.
And I think, you know, there is a situation to turn around, especially when you're a club, the stature and the size of Spurs, right? You're obviously going to consider going down. And obviously, Vinay, who's come in part of the board and taken over, he's going to be under pressure anyway, because anyone at a board level is always under pressure. But if you've appointed a new manager and they've just come in, especially on the back of sacking Ange, Levy step back, you're certainly going to have that added pressure anyway, right? And now Frank's underperforming. You've got some top players who are falling out with Frank. And all the pressure is on to try and turn that season around and to give that stability back to Spurs and try and rebuild, which you're going to expect for the 2026-27 season. But do you think that the Igor Tudor appointment is a good appointment? Do you think he will stabilise the club, or do you think it's going to be a shaky few months considering his managerial record and the positions which he's been in previously at other clubs?
I think on this one, it could be the unknown, because you could argue that he's managed some decent clubs there, including Juventus spell, where he renovated them and got them going again. All right, didn't kick on after that, and it shows that he can go into a club and kick them up the backside, if you like, and re-energize teams. I just don't know. I think with the Premier League, it's a different beast completely in that respect, that it's, as you hear a lot of managers say now, it's a much more physical league. I look at Spurs. I don't think we have a lot of physicality in there, and I think you can't get that physicality to improve that physicality, should we say, within the final 2 months now of the season. That's something that can be done. You could argue 3/4 to go of season or half a season, but not 2 months really. I mean, obviously, we was in that situation last week. It was sort of a swings and roundabouts moment when we could have dented Arsenal's title challenge. You know, our biggest rival was like, it happened when we spoke on for pod, I think last year, or whenever it was about the City Spurs game situation. Now, on that is, it was weird because Igor Tudor, if Spurs would have won that game, he could have become an instant Tottenham legend. But on the other hand, if it was a defeat like it was for defeat, it was the magnitude it was, it left it as a very toxic place at the Tottenham Stadium after. So I think he's got a big job on his hands. I think there's players there that you could argue that should be enough to get us through. We've got enough experience in that squad somewhat. I mean, you look at last week when he played Archie Gray, Radu Dragusin, Mickey van der Ven, Jed Spence, and Polina as a back line. You could argue in that sense alone, yes, Archie Gray is very young, but he's now established into that side. He's known what top flight involves. That's a very experienced back line. And then to get pummeled by your next door neighbours 4-1 at home doesn't bode well. It would have been very interesting what that team talk would have been like in that dressing room after the game. And I do think, I'm not going to say that Gabriel did dive or not, because I'm not going to make excuses on that. We should have just been up for the game no matter what. But if it was made to 2-2, could it have been a different outcome? But saying this again in training to the boys the other night, could have pulled it back to 2-2, but it still would have been Spurs and would have lost 4-2 or 5-2.
And I think you make the exact point there, mate. I think that's the Spurs way. And But as you say there, I think that's the point. If he had won that first game, especially against Arsenal, I think he would have made a statement that he is the new Spurs manager, and here he is, not just the Spurs fans, but for the rest of the Premier League, and certainly would have upset Arsenal even better, especially in their title bid, right? But he would have got off to that start and had that confidence from the squad and certainly the fans then, and certainly that belief and that uplift to try and turn that season around. Like, that's a really good point to come in, start, uplift the team by beating their biggest rivals, Arsenal. Picking up the 3 points and then building upon that for the year to come. So it was a shame that he did lose in that respect, but it'd be interesting again in another point whether Arsenal continue to go on and win that league, especially with the way that City are building. But in terms of just finishing up on the Spurs segment here, right, Jord, who do you think will be the next Spurs manager, or who would you like to be the next Spurs manager?
I think this is it. I've seen that De Zerbi's been linked. I don't dispute that he plays a good brand of football. He's shown that even at Brighton when he was there. But I don't think I would necessarily want to go with De Zerbi, even though that's more of a Spurs style way of playing. And I'm going to say a reason for that. I think I saw whether it's true or not, you read it in between the lines, I suppose, what you see on social media. But I don't know if you saw it, Luca, where he was berating one of the players in the dressing room that was caught on camera, saying pretty much he wanted them to leave in front of the whole group. I don't think, even though, well, for starters, camera there, was it because it was a De Zerbi moment, if you like, on camera, just to get attention, or was it? But I just don't agree with that full stop that you do that in front of a whole group of players in a dressing room, that you berate someone like that. So I think that just could lead to more toxic culture within the team dynamics at the moment. So I wouldn't really want De Zerbi. Poch, of course, heart says yes. Brain says another matter. Because I feel like I would really want him to come in, and yes, everyone, I think that's it. A lot of fans think that would be for problem solved. Getting Poch in, club legend in that respect, well adored, knows how Spurs works. But my theory in there is, if he was to go in and we stayed up by the skin of our teeth, just say first 5-6 games that he was in charge and we only picked up 3 or 4 points out of a possible 18, we'll be in the same situation. And then for all that love that was put onto Poch, you could argue, then it would turn very sour again. And football's very funny, and you could say fickle in that respect. That people do tend to forget of what people have done for a club. That's what I say. Poch, I'm on the fence with, because I see it to both sides. This sounds really actually so bizarre, and I know probably a lot of Spurs fans, if they did listen to this, they'll probably look at me and think, "What am I on?" But I would take Gareth Southgate in a heartbeat at Tottenham.
That is certainly an interesting decision there, mate, in terms of Gareth Southgate. I know there's a lot of fans on the fence in terms of what they think of Gareth anyway. I'm a big, huge Southgate fan, right? And I think he's a good manager. I think he's learned from Middlesbrough. I think you can't write him off because of his time at Middlesbrough. That was when he was first stepping into management and when he was much younger. And a lot of time has moved on since then. Now, I know people judge him on the tactics at England, but you know, there is that question. Well, actually, had the right tactics to get England that far, and he's stabilised the national team. He's done a lot of positive things, and he's actually a good person manager, people manager. To correct that, then, and would he get a lot of young English players playing for him and identifying that and utilising the academy? And would Spurs be a good fit in terms of that structure which he needs to bring and try and bring that toxicity out of the club? So I think Southgate is certainly an interesting shout, mate, and certainly whether he steps back into management is definitely going to be an interesting one. I'd like to see him back, especially at club level, just to see what he could do. But it's about giving managers that period of time to really have that opportunity to embed their ideas and to really respect what they're doing. And you might go through that slump, but I think you need to push through that slump to try and keep building. And you look at clubs like Nottingham Forest, who have made decisions on managers this year multiple times, right? Spurs have gone on and made that But then you look at clubs like Burnley, and Burnley have stuck with Scott Parker right throughout the year. And I think part of that is part of the Burnley way in terms of, well, if we're going to go down, we'll just keep the Championship manager, which we have, who's proven to bring us back up. And then we can just utilise him and keep that stability, rebuild part of the squad because players might leave at the end of the year anyway. And some of them might have Premier League opportunities. But if we keep the manager in terms of Scott Parker, the club has that stability. They have potentially an asset in terms of Scott. And we'll try and come back up. And if we're in the same position when we come back up, then perhaps we make that movement whether we sack him. But I think clubs do need to give that time to the manager. I think West Ham have been a surprising one at the moment. I know we touched upon that a little bit earlier because they could have easily sacked Nuno at this point. I really like Nuno. I don't want West Ham to get relegated with him. But they're not performing and not picking up enough points. So you think, well, they could have acted and they perhaps could have done a Nottingham Forest this year and then gone on to appoint someone else to try and stabilise them and keep them up. But one of the questions that I have for you, Jord, is if you're in charge of West Ham now, and I know they announced a lot of losses yesterday, and it's been a terrible year for them in terms of how they performed. And there's always that fallout between the board and the fans, especially over at West Ham. But a lot of clubs are in this position. You know, Spurs don't like their owners. And again, I got big questions over that as a fan. Chelsea fans don't really like the Chelsea owners. United fans don't like the United ones. Crystal Palace obviously having a bit of a ownership fallout and perhaps have been in that question for a few years. So no matter what club, you're always getting that question.